Hello. Now, according to polling data, the majority of us at some time have experienced what we call disinformation or misinformation online. That's false or misleading information. Now, there's nothing new about false or misleading information. Propaganda and deception has been around with us since ancient times and really got going when the printing press was invented and the advent of mass media. What's different now is technology is able to disseminate it across the globe with a speed that means it's very difficult for us to keep up. Now, there are various responses that have been taken on board to respond to this challenge, two of which are fact-checking and debunking. Now, we've been working on a report that looks into fact-checking and debunking, and it's that report and that research that we're going to talk to our researchers today about. So with me in the studio, coming online to join us, I've got James Pamment and Anneli Kimber-Lindwall, who are two of the authors of the report, and they're from Lund University, who we partnered with for the research. And also joining me, I've got Major Mark Peebles, who's here with us in Latvia with the Canadian Armed Forces. And he's a public affairs officer and has to deal with this challenge on a daily basis. So James, Anneli and Mark, good afternoon to you. James, if we could get down to the basics, what do we mean by fact-checking and debunking?
Ben, usually these two terms are used interchangeably. We talk about fact-checking and debunking as though they're the same thing. The history of fact-checking is really more about quality journalism and making sure that every data point in a news article is accurate. No fact is too small to check and correct and make sure that the dates are correct. Every small detail needs to be analysed carefully, and that's the difference between quality journalism and bad journalism. And what we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years is a lot more interest, particularly in fact-checking politicians. And we've seen a lot of NGOs and a lot of newsrooms expand their fact-checking capabilities. But this isn't really the same thing as debunking when you're looking at disinformation, although there are some overlaps. Usually when you're talking about debunking for disinformation, you're not being non-partisan. You don't care about every fact. Often you're doing it because of a specific problem that you want to correct. So for example, you may be aware of pro-Kremlin media spreading disinformation. So you create a fact-checking organization to deal with that. So that means that what you're doing is not checking every single fact out there, but you're focused on a specific problem. Often what you're doing is strategic. So there may be a set of issues that you're interested in, for example, around vaccines. And you're likely to pick out the issues that are going to have the biggest impact. So you don't try and correct every single piece of disinformation, but actually you'd be focusing on the ones that can cause most harm. So the main difference between fact-checking and debunking for our purposes is that debunking is a strategic activity that's designed to solve a certain problem, whereas fact-checking is almost a neutral activity that looks at every single fact that can be checked.
So when we talk about debunking, the big differences are debunking's not non-partisan, it's targeted and it's strategic. Anneli, I'm wondering if you could give us a broad outline. Fact-checking and debunking have come about because they're in response to this challenge of disinformation, and I'm just wondering if you could give a short overview of why this is such a challenge, who's doing it and why is it such a problem?
Yes, hello from me as well. Nice to be here today. Well, I'm sure our audience consists of a lot of experts who already know why is this a problem and why we are talking about this. But very briefly, how we maybe approach this in our paper was first to kind of be clear about the terminology. What is the difference about misinformation between misinformation and disinformation, and the way we kind of use that in our paper, approach that in our paper is that we treat misinformation as verifiably false information that is spread without intent. and then disinformation is verifiably false information that is spread with clear intent, intentionally to mislead. And coming from that, we looked at different actors who are dealing with it. But in response to your question, who does it and why, I guess we should start from the states and governments, which is also, although I'm for this research affiliated with the Lund University. I previously worked for the StratCom task force, and there we looked at, and they're still looking at Russia as the main actor behind the disinformation campaign. But states and governments, intelligence agencies with deliberate intention to mislead people for several variety of reasons. Then politicians or political parties, which we see across the countries, using all sorts of tools for that, fake identities, websites, amplifying certain topics, etc. Then definitely another actor is non-governmental organizations, activists, different kinds of religious bodies. They usually take this issue-based disinformation that, focus on some specific issue that they want to disinform their audiences about, and use that. I think we've seen it very much, and still seeing it very much around the COVID-19 pandemic and different types of health issues. And then, of course, different fringe networks, average end users, students, people who have different kind of objectives in mind when disinforming people. And they can be economic, the reasons can be because they can disinform, more wider, maybe just discredit and polarize the societies, polarize alliances, confuse people, and then, of course, then when it comes coming back to the states and governments, it very clearly is part of information influence operations.
Thank you, Anneli. Now over to you, Mark. Now, Mark, this is the kind of thing that I sense you have to deal with on an almost daily basis.
Yeah, relatively regularly, Ben. There's a bit of a distinction, and we'll get into it a little bit later, I believe, between like disinformation and what we would call adversarial media coverage. But there are adversaries, people who do not agree with our presence here in the Baltics, and would seek to convince audiences to see things the same way, and whether that's through editorializing their message, or whether it is through presenting false data to back up their portrayal of our presence here. Whether it's to their their key audiences, their own internal audiences, whether it's to audiences here, or whether it's to audiences, variously, there's always an effort to try and paint us and our presence here as something other than the way we present it. So it's an ongoing battle there, Ben.
So, I mean, Mark, to explain to people, you're here as part of Enhanced Forward Presence, deployed with the Canadian Battle Group. Now, obviously, there will be, foreign state actors which will be not happy about the fact that you're here. But there will be others that simply want to comment on it and sell newspapers, for want of a better expression. And there's a very fine line between sensationalist coverage and deliberate disinformation, isn't there?
Oh, well, yes, and the two are complementary. In the vast majority of what we deal with are what, is, as you pointed out, what we could call sensationalist, or what we've called it here at times, gray zone, pardon the abuse of the term, but gray zone media, in the sense that they can take accurate information, but will contextualize it, distort that contextualization to suit their narrative. Oftentimes, we've seen in adversarial media accounts of us a story that is perhaps 20% accurate information plucked from some other media article, and then 80% editorial content and editorializing it and then distorting the context that of the original information to suit their narrative. The other tactic that we've seen oftentimes is a sensational headline, a sensational front page picture that suits the adversarial narrative, but has a very, very thin, very long thread of connection between that and the story, which oftentimes is cut and paste wholesale from another media organization, like a wire service media organization. So if all you did was headline surf or look at the pictures, you would come away with a markedly different impression of what the story is than if you actually read the article. So is it disinformation? Not perhaps in the classic sense. However, it does create a similar effect that would be served by disinformation.
Mark, when we talk about debunking, is debunking a process or something that you would do regularly?
No, as your research document has said, you got to pick your battles. In some cases, it's not worth it to debunk it for a variety of reasons. Perhaps the media portal that it shows up in is really a small fringe portal. In some cases, it relates to an audience that wouldn't even resonate with your debunking efforts. They wouldn't receive it. They're already drinking the Kool-Aid, as it were. The other thing is, you want to take, it's a matter of how much staff effort and work you want to put into it, and how much more is going to be required depending on how your adversary reacts to your debunking. You may end up getting pulled into a tar baby affair where the more you engage, the more you get engaged. And next thing you know, you're spending more time than you ever really should on it. So sometimes you got to pick your battles.
So this idea of picking battles, I mean, when we discussed this earlier on, we inevitably ended up talking about the blowback effect. James, you seem to, on Anneli, we talked about this, and you said that we might be fixated on this one piece of research, and we need to move on from it. James Pamment.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about the backfire effect, which for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's the idea that by repeating the piece of disinformation, even when you're correcting it, people fixate on what they've heard and they remember it, but they don't remember all of the details and all of the context, so they end up remembering the disinformation. And this piece of research has been around for more than a decade now, and there have been lots of studies since that seem to show that actually it isn't as strong as people initially thought. But what it's done, I think, is contributed to a debate in which there's a belief that the science gives you some kind of backing with this idea that if we debunk, we need to be really careful, pick our battles. Let's not debunk everything, because all we're then doing is repeating it and perhaps giving it more airtime than it really deserves, and perhaps it would just vanish on its own, or people would ignore it on their own. But there has been a revised version of the debunking handbook that came earlier this year that was really clear on how this research is updated, and in fact they argue that in most cases the backfire effect isn't as big an issue as we perhaps thought. But I don't think that takes away from the question, and I think Mark was on this as well, that you can't correct everything. You have to pick the things that are most relevant, that can do the most harm, and use your resources wisely.
I think that's a good time to introduce. So myself and Mark sat down yesterday and we came up with our own piece of disinformation that we created. And I'm interested to hear from Mark and you, James, when this comes across your desk and you are first made aware of this piece of information, this piece of disinformation, what happens next? And Mark, I think the first thing is that a lot of people get very excited about the fact that there's been some kind of disinformation attack.
Indeed, Ben. when somebody, especially our more enlightened commanders or people in the chain of command who are Twitter hounds, they'll come upon this and they will get excited, and I understand it. These kinds of things will generate some hard questions.
So what are your considerations when something like this comes across your desk, Mark? What's the thinking that you go through?
Well, first thing is, who is it? Understand where this is coming from, who it is coming from, understanding what their reach is, who they're reaching out to, who their audience is. So you get a sense of just how virulent and how how dangerous this tweet really is. So once you do that, then you start to take a look at what their message is, what is erroneous, and then fact check to make sure that what they're saying is in fact erroneous. And then once you understand that, it becomes a matter of, okay, well, what do you do about it? Who speaks to it? Who debunks? How much effort do we want to put into this? What platform? And what kind of language do we want to use? Because do we want to engage the audience that Twitter is that tweeter is getting towards, or do you want to go to your own audience? So these are a couple of things we factor in when we first encounter it there, Ben.
And James, what kind of approaches would you be thinking of at this stage?
Well, I would just add on top of what Marcus said, because I think he's covered a lot of the main points. I would just add that when you're responding, there are probably 3 tactical choices you can make. One is to go counter message, which means you essentially rebut or correct the false message. So you would say, no, there were not 120 Canadian soldiers arriving with COVID. The second is to go counter narrative, which is to try to understand the broader story that's happening here, the broader narratives, and try to counter from that perspective. So you might talk about how you screen your soldiers before they travel, for example, as a way of expanding and taking a bigger picture approach. And then thirdly, you can go counter brand, which means figuring out who was behind the message and trying to undermine their credibility as a brand, as a trustworthy news source.
Anneli, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, in addition to that, I would foresee that, it's not, if you show that again, it was not many shares and retweets. So again, it's back to the fact that establish who are you, who is responding to this, and what is your kind of role in hopefully what is a strategic approach to disinformation, wherever you are based at, or in government or organization or whatever actor, and then you see how you fit into this and how are you going to handle this, and whether you should actually react, whether you should highlight this to your partners, whether you should highlight this to your analytic department to look into the wider narratives behind this. So again, I hope we come back to this topic a bit later in the discussion, but how does it fit into your overall approach basically to disinformation from the point of view who you are as an actor?
So thank you, Anneli. So the graphic that we used there was as an example of, I think, of disinformation. If we could show the next graphic, which is when that disinformation gets laundered, if you like, and then ends up in a more mainstream publication. Are we thinking about the same approaches? Has it suddenly got a bit more serious? James, Mark?
I guess I'll jump in. When it gets laundered like this, then the problem becomes more complex, and you become, it becomes a question of, okay, when do you interject? When do you debunk? How far do you let this go? Because now you're dealing with more than just one actor, and then you got to spend a little bit more time in connecting the dots between the article in which it appears and the tweeter that originated this information, because then you may be able to glean some insights into, all right, is it the same person? Are they connected? How are they connected? And from there you can start deducing some things about what they're trying to get at with this. But also it's a matter of, again, understanding where this is this a fringe media media portal? Is their audience, constituted of a bunch of loony, loony fringe people? So, sort of QAnon conspiracy types. So that's what I would add,
and
James.
all of this is taking time, isn't it, when you're doing this?
Indeed, Ben. It can take upwards of at least 5-6 hours of staff work in the initial phase, and that's over and above all the other things that the people like me have to deal with. So one of the factors you may want to consider is the adversary just trying to waste your time, or trying to get you off your message by interjecting a message that have to debunk and deal with.
And James, one of the recommendations you made in the research was exposing an attribution. And that gets increasingly more difficult as this information becomes diffuse, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think the question that you're really looking for is to figure out, is this a one-off piece of disinformation that someone's created and is spreading just on a one-time event, or is it part of a coordinated campaign against you? And if it's a coordinated campaign against you, then that needs to be weighed up against your interests as an organization. What kind of harm is this potentially causing to the public? And then you can consider the kind of response that would be appropriate. Now, the response may involve exposing the techniques, educating the public in how this disinformation works. It may involve an attribution in order to be able to say this actor is behind it, and in that case to embarrass them. It may involve revealing their techniques so that it's harder for them to continue working this way. So there's a whole host of options available. But the major problem, I think, going back to what Mark was saying, is you can't answer everything. There's only a limited amount of time and resources that you have. So you really need to pick your battles and pick those ones that are likely to have the highest impact.
And James, sorry, Anneli, go ahead.
And if I can just add on this, on the resource, and as Mark was describing how much effort it might be to do all of that investigation yourself, going into looking at the background of the website and all of that. What we clearly saw, and I mean, we knew before, what we clearly saw when we were doing research for this paper was how much best practice there is out there, how much knowledge, how much expertise there is in different actors who are effectively debunking or fact-checking or in working on this issue. So I guess one of the solutions is to really use more of that best practice out there and cooperate with the actors who already have the knowledge, so you don't have to do all of that yourself, as for example, as in a position where Mark is at.
So, Anneli, that takes us quite nicely to the best practice piece and how we can learn from other organisations. Could you give an overview of who else is working this patch in terms of who is out there doing the fact-checking and the debunking?
Yes, sure. So I guess one of the discoveries to myself personally, I mean, you tend to see the issue of fact-checking and debunking from the point of view where you're active, and as I've been working on together with the StratCom in the past, it was much more limited into that area. But when I lifted, let's say, the overview on what is happening overall, you quickly discover that it's a very wide practice, referring back to what James was saying in the beginning. And of course, partially it's a common, a normal practice that media organizations do, but it's also wider, very much wider, how NGOs in different countries all over the world use fact-checking for different kinds of objectives. So it was quickly evident that we need to categorize them and have some kind of measures of success to make sense of the best practice that is out there, and also make sure that it is useful for the people who want to use this paper. So what we came up with and what we saw was these categories. First of all, governments, of course, governments who do a lot, who involve in kind of fact-checking and debunking activities. Different kinds of best practice out there. We looked at Lithuania and the famous debunk.eu initiative. That is a whole, let's say, a very comprehensive initiative that brings together different elements. We looked at Sweden, how MSB has used a handbook and also then informed specific activities in that regard. and some other governments, which you can see more in the paper. Then definitely organizations, intergovernmental organizations, EU, StratCom task force, NATO, taking a different approach. A lot of UN agencies now with the health crisis and then the COVID pandemic, having a role in this and then doing something. Thirdly, we looked at news media, and also not in a traditional way how news media is using fact-checking as part of their regular work, but also how news media is participating in global collaborations to do more of, let's say, strategic fact-checking, as we refer to, and how this is working. So looking at different Reuters, a Trusted News Initiative, Washington Post in America, so all kinds of different best practice there. Then the biggest category for sure is the non-profits that engage in such activities for very different objectives and reasons, and also with very different kind of success measures. So if you look at the paper, you can find a lot of best practice there. And then universities and think tanks who are kind of relying on their already existing research practice and very good trustworthy reputation while doing so. So we have several examples of that. Then digital investigators, also very important. It's kind of a new trend, or let's say new very important area of fact-checking and debunking on a larger scale. For example, Bellingcat and Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, who also contributed to the paper, who do large-scale investigations on very kind of global, even security issues and larger topics, and use fact-checking as part of their approach. And then two remaining categories we flagged was philanthropists, more in the US, and then some kind of temporary initiatives that are launched only, for example, for elections, in time for elections, or in time for example, dealing with the pandemic at the moment, that have only very specific objective and then don't exist afterwards. So that's kind of in a nutshell how we categorize them. And if you look at the report, you see a lot of examples in that regard and best practice.
And we also looked at some of the success factors. And James, I'm wondering if you could just particularly talk perhaps about governments and the biggest section, which was the non-profits, and talk about what we saw that they were doing that we thought made them successful in what they were doing.
Sure. I think part of the issue is that the success factors are a little bit different from what the research says. So the research into confirmation bias, for example, you can study messages, you can do experiments and see the recall, and you can see how many people change their behavior because of the message, and that's one way of assessing success. But because countering disinformation is more of a strategic activity, it's not just about whether the messaging changes behavior or achieves its goal. It's actually much more about whether the initiative itself achieves its strategic goals. So, for example, if an intergovernmental organization is creating a counter-disinformation unit, something like the StratCom task force, some of the things that you might be looking for as a success factor would be things like, does it have a clear mandate? Does it have a support from member states? Are the member states providing resources and support and direction to that organization? Are the activities focused? Are they limited on a specific goal? For example, StratCom was organized as an awareness raising campaign, so it had a very focused and targeted set of objectives. And it seems as though it's those kind of factors, in addition to the science of whether the messages are actually achieving their goals, that contribute to success.
And James, just to lead on from that, and this is a question that's come in from one of our viewers online, who do we think should be leading this particular effort in terms of fact-checking and debunking? Is there a natural leader, or is it a bit of a free-for-all?
Well, at the moment, it is a bit of a free-for-all. I think in an ideal world, this should be a non-governmental activity. Certainly fact-checking in its traditional sense couldn't be done by a government. It has to be independent and non-partisan. But I think there are aspects of disinformation that are really related to public safety and national security. And in those cases where the public really is at risk, governments and intergovernmental organizations do have a responsibility to protect the publics. So I think they need to be involved and they need to lend their credibility to these activities. But that can also involve then working with and through NGOs and universities and think tanks.
So, and Anneli, NATO and the EU are talking an awful lot about this issue at the moment and starting to, or continuing to work together. Are we the people that should be taking the lead on this? Who do you think should be carrying the flag?
Well, I think the answer to that question is really that everyone should know their role in this, and everyone should have addressing disinformation as part of their strategy in terms of protecting, their own democracies and societies. So everyone should lead from their perspective role. Now, when it comes to the EU and NATO, I mean, when the StratCom task force was set up more than 5 years ago, already the cooperation between the EU and NATO in that sense started, and it has kind of evolved and developed from that on. But I think there is a very unique role that international organizations can and should have, and specifically EU and NATO, whereas countries can deal with specific disinformation linked to their specific topics and countries, whereas organizations have a much wider perspective, and they can see what is popping up where, across the member states, across the allies, and spot kind of a wider narratives and trends, and then kind of compile that and raise awareness on a much larger scale. So as James said, it's maybe not directly linked with everyday fact checking, and that let's leave that to the experts, but the analytical part of it and taking kind of enforcing role in this is very relevant, and I think this is what both EU and NATO have now taken increasingly so.
And one of the things that we all discussed when we started the report was trying to focus on whether or not debunking and fact-checking were effective. So if it was possible to evaluate how well these organizations were doing. Could you talk about that?
Me?
Yeah, sorry,
Anneli. Absolutely. Well, I might be a little bit subjective when I talk about the EU effort, because I was a very long time part of that. But I do think that it depends how you evaluate success. And when we look at the EU's StratCom when it started, I mean, 5 years ago, it wasn't very widely discussed, this topic of disinformation at all. I mean, we didn't talk about the actors, we didn't talk about disinformation on such a scale. So I think the task force had a kind of an instrumental role in raising awareness first and foremost among the media and then the decision makers to kind of bring this topic into focus, which it has done, and then since then it has developed. I think you know the NATO side much better, but it's the same there. It's a lot of kind of activities that have taken place maybe behind the curtain, so to speak. NATO has very much focused on communicating their own messages, communicating proactively on what the NATO stands for and what the NATO does. But behind the curtain, this is also a tool to kind of preempt the negative, or let's say harmful messaging. So it is difficult to evaluate, but I would say that we wouldn't have this discussion today, wouldn't have this paper if there wasn't more focus on this topic overall, and that is
Absolutely.
also due to the work of both organizations.
Yeah, so James, the question that I had for you at some point when we were talking about this project is, when we were discussing evaluation of debunking, and if it was effective, what does the science say?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because I think we need to distinguish between two approaches, and one is the kind of fundamental research, these big studies that look at messages and how you word them, and then do experimental studies and come back with, very clear responses in terms of, this kind of messaging works, this kind of messaging doesn't work. those are really useful, like a scientific background to give the fundamentals. But at the same time, we also have 5, 6, 7 years now of practical experience from people like Mark and Anneli, who've been doing this day in, day out for years. And this is a second layer, if you like, of sort of practice that we need now to start combining with the science in order to develop a more accurate and more useful way of evaluating counter disinformation efforts. And the reason it's different is because if you're just fact checking, yes, you can rely on the science and those experimental studies. But if you're actually countering disinformation, there's a bunch of other factors that are important, things like your strategic objectives, things like attribution, things specifically related to the campaign that you're running that we also need to learn from. So I think we're in a really interesting place now where in the next year or two, we will develop measures to find out how effective these kinds of approaches really are.
Thank you. Now, we do offer our viewers online to submit their questions to the three of you. And I've had one that's come up, which I know you'll all be look forward to answering. And this is coming in your direction, Mark, so pay attention. Disinformation consists of stories. Fact-checking and debunking addresses facts. How can they be effective? Mark, will the truth always win out?
Well, it depends on your point of view. In this arguably post-fact age, it depends on which truths you like. However, if we do operate on the assumption that consensus can be achieved on what the truth is, eventually. But I think where the question is going is just debunking the erroneous information is not enough. Because if you just correct the fact or correct the disinformation, you're only doing half the battle. What you do need to do is to reinforce what the accurate information is and tie that to your narrative, your strategic narrative, and get people back on track to what your narrative is, and to help increase the absorption of that narrative. So again, on the assumption that a consensus on truth can be achieved and that it has value, but even more valuable is tying that truth to your narrative.
Anneli, when you were working at the European Union External Action Service, a large part of your job was correcting the record and making sure people had the right facts. Was that enough?
Well, in fact, we actually had this approach that fact-checking was only just a part of the response or part of the tasks of the whole team. Disinformation is stories. So as a first level of response, the task force also creates stories based on the debunking results. So it's not enough to just debunk something and then share this with your colleagues, or I don't know, in your immediate vicinity, and then hope that this works. I mean, you really have to use your fact checking and debunking as part of your overall raising awareness work around addressing disinformation. That was in fact what the task force was doing. But in addition, what also Mark said and what the task force was and is still doing very much so, again behind the curtains, is to getting the trying to kind of communicate the EU much better in the Eastern neighborhood, because this is where the mandate is of the task force. So really getting the narrative there, really getting the accurate information there, what the EU stands for. So it's much less ground for disinformation and all kinds of conspiracy theories, while people know much more what the EU stands for and what the EU does in cooperation with these countries. So I agree fully with that question. Also, what Mark said, it's just a very small kind of a part of the work, and it needs to be linked with your wider communication approach.
Yeah. So this idea of fact checking and debunking being one component, and there's a bigger picture here, isn't there, Anneli?
Well, absolutely. I think even before we kind of finalized the paper about but definitely during the process of writing this, it's very clear that we, in a way, we shouldn't even ask this question anymore, whether we should be fact-checking or debunking. I mean, it's happening everywhere, and for several reasons, for several objectives. The question really is how it fits into the work that you do. The question is how it fits into the wider picture and your strategy in addressing disinformation, and who is doing what, basically. So it's one very useful tool that should be part of your toolbox in one way or another, but it doesn't necessarily have to be you yourself as a, let's say, a press officer in a government or in an organization doing it, but you need to kind of factor this into your overall approach and have a place for that.
Thank you. Now, James, a similar issue, which is that we're hardwired to respond to these stories and disinformation because they tend to be emotional, and that's the big vulnerability. And facts are quite boring. Are we fighting a losing battle?
No, I think we have to bear in mind that you can set up a unit that does debunking and fact checking, but you, as an organization, you will also have your strategic communication, your public diplomacy, your branding work, your long-term relationships, your alliances, your network building. You have all of these communicative tools at your service. And the fact-checking or debunking part of that is really there to be put into use. So you're essentially using the truth in your service to tell your story, explain who you are and what you're doing. Assuming your organization exists to do good, which I think we would tend to assume among the organizations that we work for and support, then the truth should work in your service. And it's a question of using the truth, packaging it in a way that resonates with your audience, and trying to counteract some of the negative trends that people are putting out there through manipulation. And I don't think it's much more complicated than that.
Thank you. Now, a slight change of tack. One of the questions that we've had asked is about closed message groups, such as WhatsApp, Signal, and closed Facebook groups. And I'm wondering how we can measure or even find the edges on the impact of the kind of disinformation and misinformation which is transmitted and disseminated in this closed box. James, any thoughts on that?
So here I think we go back to the different organizations who are doing the fact-checking. And among these are the investigative journalists and the NGOs, some of whom are capable of getting into these closed groups, joining them and monitoring them. And often the research that we do have on closed social media groups actually comes from investigative journalists, for example. So they play an absolutely essential role in helping us understand what's happening in these closed groups. Then there's a question of where these activities spill out into more public forums, and that can be tracked relatively easily. But I think in these cases, we are really dependent on good journalism.
Mark, this is a kind of invisible threat, isn't it?
It is, and you have to, again, keep it in character in terms of it is an echo chamber, it is a closed environment, and the resistance that closed environment may have to your own debunking may be impenetrable. But it does, and maybe you don't need to necessarily respond in that closed environment, but what you do need to do is to keep track of it and see if any of that disinformation starts spilling out of that closed environment into other environments. So if you have a bit of disinformation in an echo chamber, that's bad enough, and you can talk about who can counter that. But when you really start, should start taking notice and taking action is when that disinformation starts bubbling into other audiences.
Anneli, do you have any? Please go ahead.
Just on the impact I don't think we have enough understanding of the impact in the open groups on social media. So I think this is definitely an area where maybe linking with the previous discussion on what science can do and what academia can do, this is definitely something that should probably and could happen more, is to look into the impact of both disinformation in different let's say domains, in different social media groups or different public groups, and also look into the impact of the measures of debunking, for example, and fact checking properly. Like the practices that we see are used very widely, do they actually work, and what is the real impact, and how they can be basically rolled out to much more actors would be important.
Thank you. Now, one of the questions that we've had asked is from our online viewers is about the most effective way of measuring the impact of disinformation. Now, I don't think we've quite got time to get to the bottom of that, but perhaps we could talk about the research agenda in terms of where are we going next with trying to understand this a bit more. James Pamment.
Yeah, so I think it's the big question that still needs to be answered. You know, what is the impact of disinformation, and then what is the impact of the countermeasures? And so far, there are some promising projects out there. People are getting started with this work, but I think we're still a couple of years away from really having any clear answers. When we designed this project, we imagined it almost as the first chapter of a 3 to 5 year, huge research study, and this would just lay out some of the principles. And the approach we've taken is to break down the organizations into different kinds and to different kinds of objectives. So what is it that your debunking initiative is trying to achieve? And then develop indicators that help show whether that those goals are being achieved, whether it's being done in an effective way. So in the report, we outline a series of indicators for different kinds of initiatives that gives a kind of baseline for thinking about how you might then evaluate them. But we think, yes, you can break down organizations by type and develop indicators, but still each organization is so unique and they have their own goals. So every organization that's doing debunking would need its own set of measures in order to understand whether it's effective. So we need to move towards kind of shared standards, but at the same time, understand the differences. So it's quite a challenge, but I think we've made some initial steps in this report.
And Mark, from your desk as a practitioner, what particular problems which you believe are solvable would you like to see addressed in the next 1 or 2 years?
I think there's more scope for, I don't know if automation would solve it, but getting quicker, spending less time on the forensics. So a better, quicker tool or process in terms of understanding the source and origin of the disinformation. Because once you have a better understanding of who's doing this to you, you can better deduce what their objectives are, and even if you may have some problems measuring the success of your own debunking, you may be able to measure it by how effective their disinformation activities were in achieving what you believe their objectives were. It's a bit of a mug's game, but I think getting better and quicker at doing the forensics of the origin of the disinformation would definitely be of help.
And Anneli, this links to one of the other questions that we've had asked, is about toolkits and software platforms. Now, there's a great promise of automation and what automation might be able to deliver in the next decade or so. How do you see that playing out? What tools and software are we using now, and how do you think that's likely to develop over the next few years?
Well, the truth is that the disinforming actors are always ahead. So whatever we are developing and using, definitely as let's say people in the governments or international organizations or in the public sector are afraid to kind of use the new technologies and look into them and embrace them quickly enough. So I think we need to speed up, and that in general that is quite an important point, I think, both for academia and practitioners to kind of be aware how quickly this develops, you know, how much ahead the adversary very often is. So we have to bear that in mind. But I think you know we are in a good place to understand better and be more conscious of the best practice, also of the best practice out there and the actors that we have listed in the some of them we have listed in the paper who are already using very effectively the new technologies. We have whole you know different types of NGOs or different types of think tanks who are using very much you know artificial intelligence for spotting disinformation, plus you know all different kinds of technologies. So it is out there. I think it's really more about being aware of that. Also moving on from discussing whether this is important that we do that, to really accept that we need to do that. We need to see the reality and then kind of cooperate more and find our own strategic responses which link up with each other.
And James, is technology going to come to the rescue, or is this a human problem?
The technology can help out, like in most cases, it can be useful. I mean, machine learning is already used by some of the counter-disinformation units. It helps identify potential disinformation, but you still need humans, you know, skilled communications officers to interpret the data. And you still need skilled communications officers to develop communication strategies that respond. So I think if you're in the audience and you work in communications, your job is safe. The tools may help you make quicker decisions. They may help identify things in an automated way, but you're still going to need to weigh up the decision of whether to respond, and if so, how. That's still going to be something that requires a human response.
Okay, thank you.
I would say that.
Go on, Anneli.
That you can, to a certain extent, automate the research and the monitoring, but you will always need professionals to develop your own response, and you know it's difficult to see it going any other way.
Thank you. Now, our final question before we wrap up is about what I think I would describe as hyper-partisan or biased media outlets. Now, they're not doing anything illegal, but what they're still doing is harmful. How do we factor these kind of news organizations into this, the mix here? James?
Well, I don't think we should be shy in calling them out. We should expose when they spread disinformation. We should reveal some of their tactics. It may be possible to go counter-brand. So, for example, if there's funding behind them that's questionable, if there's evidence that there's an agenda behind what they're doing that's questionable. But I think it should be based on something that they've actually done and not the fact that they exist. So I think that's often sometimes it's tempting just to criticize a platform, a news platform, because of who they're funded by and because what their intentions are. I think we need to begin with something they've done that's a problem, and then start questioning some of the other aspects about them.
I'll ask you the same thing, Anneli, because there must be some disinformation or misinformation that comes from you know, domestic sources.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it goes back to the kind of list I said in the beginning. I mean, I agree with James. I think that's. I'm a practitioner, so I tend to kind of answer every question like that we need to just crack on, you know, with things. It's a certain amount of time we can mull over whether we should be doing this and that, but the more concrete, the more practical it gets, the more we can see who our partners are, whether and how to support them to expand their work, to use their work, how does it fit into our strategy. So again, it would be the same answer in that regard.
Thank you. Now, we've only got a few minutes left, so I will wrap up by asking the three of you the very simple question to get back to fact-checking and debunking. And of course, you are more than welcome to say it depends, or we need more detail on that. But the question is, are fact-checking and debunking effective at countering disinformation? Anneli.
Yeah, I sound like a broken record here, but yes, I think they are very important as one of the tools in the toolbox. I think we should move on from debating whether they should be there. I think they are there. They're there to stay. More and more organizations are doing it on different platforms. They're using different tools, having different objectives. So we just need to see, and by we, I mean at the moment, like public sector communication people, to how to use this better. And also a comment to something we discussed before on measuring impact. I think it's very important, and we need to kind of continue with that, both scientifically and also maybe as governments, as international organizations, to look at public opinion more on narratives that we already know that are very prominent disinformation narratives, to look at the public opinion and how much impact disinformation has had on certain topics, and that kind of research would be also easily doable and useful for practitioners in that regard. So yes, is my answer.
Mark, what's your vote on this?
I would say yes, but it only goes so far. As Anneli and James have mentioned, it is but one tool. And if you use only that one tool, I think you will only succeed so much. I think if it is used in conjunction with understanding the adversary, understanding the audience they're trying to reach, and then look at using debunking as just but one measure of communicating to that audience to counter the adversary and the effect that you believe he wants to achieve. So it's an important tool. I would say you want to have it as opposed to not use it, but it is not in itself a cure-all.
Thank you. James Pamment, final words from you, please.
Yeah, shockingly, I will agree with the previous speakers. I'll just add that I think that it's a really important thing on its own, but then if you add in additional factors, it becomes like a force multiplier. So things like disincentivizing the spread of disinformation. Can you impose costs on those who are doing it? Can you deplatform them? Can you remove any economic incentives? These are all things that would increase the effectiveness of debunking. And if you add into that, then finally, I think the most important thing, which is your own communications and your own story and getting that out there, then I think they all add to the effectiveness of debunking. So these aren't things to think about in isolation, but as part of a tool set, as something that can be multiplied when you're using other techniques as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, that about wraps it up from us today. Just time to remind you that our new report will be available online on fact-checking and debunking, a best practice guide to countering disinformation. And to say thank you to our three guests today, Anneli, Mark and James. Next week, our director, Janis, will be in the chair, and he will be joined by guests Morgan Lofsson from the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency and John Hussain from the National Security Comms team of the UK government. And they will be here to talk about the communications challenges surrounding the vaccination programme. Until then, goodbye.